I caught my wife cheating on me. In a fit of rage, I beat up her lover. As a result, I was sentenced to 10 years in prison. 3 months into my sentence, my wife came to visit me with her lover, David, and brought divorce papers. I glared at them with pure hatred and signed my name furiously. David took the papers, smirked, and said, "I'll take good care of your family, your wife, and your daughter. Hope you make it out of here alive." He laughed loudly, wrapped his arm around my wife's waist, and they left together. My eyes were cold, and my heart was filled with overwhelming hatred. The next day, I was ambushed by another inmate while taking a shower. 5 months in, someone shoved 2 breads down my throat during a meal, nearly choking me to death. A year into my sentence, while working in the workshop, a large iron ingot fell from above and crushed my leg. One of my cellmates couldn't stand it anymore and had a talk with some people. After that, I was left alone. There were 4 of us in the cell, including me. The other 3 were in their 50s, Seth, Robert, and Matt. Seth was serving 20 years. Robert, a business tycoon, was also serving 20 years for financial crimes. Matt, a former gang member, was in for 20 years too. They took pity on me and spoke up on my behalf, and I didn't face any more attacks. They shared their stories with me out of boredom, and I was both shocked and learned a lot from them. After being ambushed multiple times, I became ruthless, fighting with a reckless abandon. In my second year in prison, my younger sister visited me, crying and telling me our parents had died. I was overwhelmed with grief and tears. I knew David, who made his fortune in construction, had something to do with their deaths. In my third year, my sister visited again, but this time she was with David. I lost control and banged my head against the glass window. My sister, leaning on David's shoulder, said, "Brother, I'm David's mistress now. Even your wife agrees." David, with a smug smile, said, "Don't worry, brother-in-law. There will be a surprise waiting for you when you get out. Your daughter is growing up fast as well." As the guards dragged me away, I felt a cold calmness. I stared at David, knowing this grudge would never end until one of us was dead. In my 8th year, my sentence was reduced. Before I left, Seth gave me a phone number, saying his former subordinate could help me if needed. Robert, the businessman, handed me an address where he had stashed some cash for me to use. Matt gave me a name, his former bodyguard, who I could rely on in the future. Their families were either dead or had fled. Over the past 8 years, I had been their companion, and they had grown fond of me. Before I left, Seth smiled and said, "I've taught you for 8 years. Now you have the confidence to seek revenge. Enjoy your life." Robert also smiled and said, "Don't come back. I don't want to see you here again." Matt, expressionless, just waved his hand. And with that, I was released. Seeing the bustling world outside, I felt like I had stepped into another era. First, I took a cab to the outskirts, to the address Robert had given me. Using some tools, I dug up a small mound and found a suitcase inside. It contained about $1 million in cash. In a hidden compartment, there was a notebook with several account numbers, Robert's offshore bank accounts, holding billions of dollars. After securing the suitcase, I headed to a club and mentioned a name. After a while, a small but sharp-eyed middle-aged man appeared. He was James, Matt's former bodyguard, now running the bathhouse. James was fiercely loyal to Matt, who had once saved his life. After hearing my story, James nodded and took my suitcase upstairs. I lit a cigarette and called the number Seth had given me. After explaining Seth's situation, the person on the other end listened quietly and then said something that put my mind at ease. "He did me a big favor before. You can trust me." On my first day out of prison, I accomplished 3 tasks. Next was planning my revenge. That night, James treated me to a bath and a welcome meal. The next day, James and I began investigating David. David is now a director at Royal Real Estate, with assets worth billions. His influence is immense. After our divorce, my wife married David and moved into his mansion. My sister also moved in with them. I smirked coldly to myself, thinking, "David, I'll make you watch as the empire you've built crumbles, your proud company falls apart, and the villa you prepared for my wife turns to dust." After gathering this information, I returned to my old home with James. My wife had moved out after the divorce. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Everything seemed just as it was back then. The furniture, the bed, and the prominent wedding photo on the wall seemed to mock me. For some reason, the room was still clean and had a faint fragrance, as if someone had been regularly tidying up. Just then, the door opened, and I saw my wife walk in with a girl around 10 years old. My wife's hair was a bit messy, her skin pale, and she looked exhausted. Despite her disheveled appearance, she was still beautiful. She seemed absent-minded as she entered, her eyes dull. Then she turned and saw me. At first, she glanced casually, but then her eyes widened in shock. Her previously lifeless eyes filled with emotion, her lips trembled, and she looked at me in disbelief. She seemed dizzy and lost her balance, falling to the floor, but her eyes never left me. "Is it really you?" she asked, lying on the floor, staring at me without blinking. Her voice was shaky, filled with surprise and nervousness, as if she couldn't believe it. I couldn't find the words to respond. Seeing her again left me speechless. I had witnessed that night and endured so much suffering, all connected to the person in front of me. I didn't answer. Seeing my silence, she immediately crawled towards me on the floor. I sat on the sofa, watching her blankly. She reached me and raised a hand to touch my face. The familiar scent of her perfume was gone. I didn't move, letting her cold hand touch my face. She lay on the floor, caressing my face, my eyes, my nose, my lips. My wife stared at me for a long time, finally realizing it was really me. She burst into tears, crying out, "Why is your hair all white? You're only in your 30s." Her body trembled, and she seemed flustered. Suddenly, she stood up and pushed the girl towards me, crying, "Mary, this is your father. Call him Dad." My eyes flickered. My daughter, she had grown so much, so tall, but she shrank back into my wife's arms, saying, "He's not my dad. My dad is the chairman. This man is a beggar. He's not my dad." I took a deep breath, trying to hold back my tears. My wife slapped our daughter several times, hysterically shouting, "He is your father. Call him Dad. Call him." My daughter started crying, and my wife collapsed onto the floor. James quietly left the room, giving us some privacy. 8 years had passed. My daughter had grown taller, and my wife seemed unchanged, except for being a bit more haggard and thinner. She was still stunningly beautiful. Meanwhile, I was covered in scars, my hair completely white. Fate had been cruel. My wife comforted our daughter for a while before sending her to the next room to play. Then she and I sat facing each other in silence. After a long pause, she gave a bitter smile and murmured, "It's good you're out." I'm relieved. She then took a bank card from her purse, saying it contained $5 million, her savings from these years. She urged me to take the money and start a new life in another city, warning that David would surely seek revenge if he found me. She explained that David had forced her to divorce me, threatening to harm our entire family if she didn't comply. I continued to look at her coldly and asked softly, "How did my parents die?" Her eyes filled with regret as she replied, "I don't know, but it has to do with David. He wanted to get back at you." My fists clenched tightly as I forced myself to stay calm and asked, "What about my sister? What's going on with her?" My wife trembled as she said, "I don't know why your sister is with him, but I can't control her. She's like a madwoman." I sighed deeply. I grew up with my sister, and I know her personality better than anyone. She wants revenge too, which is why she got close to David. Seeing my silence, my wife trembled as she came closer, tears streaming down her face as she saw my scars. After a long moment, she looked at our daughter and said, "Husband, just consider me dead. I'll raise our daughter well and then atone with my life." I shook my head and asked, "It's been 8 years. Aren't you going to tell me why?" She thought for a moment, then shook her head with a sad smile, saying, "It's all in the past. You need to look forward. Take the money." I looked at her intently for a few seconds, then turned and left. As I closed the door, I heard her crying out, "Mary, he's your father. Why won't you speak? How can you not say anything?" If my wife won't tell me, I'll find out myself. I first sought out my sister. She is now the chairman of Royal Real Estate. We met secretly in a private room at a cafe to avoid being spotted by David's people. I took a roundabout route to meet her. When she saw me, she burst into tears and handed me a USB drive, telling me that she had gained David's trust step by step to avenge our parents and had obtained crucial evidence. She didn't try to persuade me to leave, but encouraged me to seek revenge. She understood me. She knew I would stop at nothing for vengeance. I took the USB drive and told her to take Mary and leave immediately. My revenge plan would shock and terrify everyone. She nodded in agreement, hesitating for a long time before saying, "Brother, our sister-in-law is actually quite pitiful. She has suffered a lot over the years to protect Mary. From my sister, I learned that David had forced my wife to marry him, threatening to make my life in prison unbearable if she refused. She had no choice but to agree. After marrying David, he often abused her. If it weren't for our daughter, she might have taken her own life long ago." Hearing this, I felt a mix of emotions. I couldn't understand why my once loving wife had betrayed me. After parting ways with my sister, I returned home. I hadn't even had a chance to look at the contents of the USB drive when I suddenly heard the sounds of a fight downstairs. Instantly on high alert, I grabbed a baseball bat nearby. Suddenly, the door was kicked open and a man with a knife charged in. Standing at the doorway, I swung the bat at the back of his head, and he collapsed to the floor. I picked up his knife just as two more armed men rushed in. Before they could react, I stood up and took them down, stabbing one and choking the other as I dragged him downstairs. Downstairs, the scene was chaotic, with bodies lying everywhere. James stood in the center, covered in blood, looking like a god of war. Despite the dozens of armed men outside, none dared to approach. Seeing that I was safe, James spat out some blood and grinned. I grinned back, tilting my head and asking, "Who sent you?" The man I was holding said, "There's a guy here who's a manager at Royal Real Estate. He told us to teach you a lesson." James immediately grabbed the manager and forced him to kneel in front of me. I squatted down, smiling, and said, "David's man?" The manager nodded. I signaled to James to send the others away. I could feel the manager trembling violently as he said, "David found out I was here because his daughter mentioned seeing her dad today." I nodded, understanding. "So David sent you to teach me a lesson, not expecting to encounter someone as crazy as me and James." Just then, the sound of police sirens filled the air. I called the number Seth had given me and explained the situation. The person on the other end said they understood and hung up. When the police arrived, they took James and me away. 3 days later, I was released without charges. The intruders were armed robbers, and we had acted in self-defense. However, James had to stay a bit longer for further investigation due to excessive force. Confronting David after my release, I went straight to the front desk of Royal Real Estate. The receptionist asked who I was looking for, and I said David. After a few minutes, a security guard escorted me to the chairman's office. David sat in his chair, glaring at me with a dark expression. I cracked my neck and smiled. "David, long time no see." He squinted and said, "I underestimated you. You've kept in good shape these past years." His eyes flickered with a mix of emotions. "What do you want?" he asked. I replied with a slightly manic tone, "Just came to see you, my old friend. I've missed you these 8 years. I've missed you so much I could die." David sneered, "I've missed you too. Every time I whipped your wife or tortured your sister, I thought of you." My eyes flickered with rage. What did he mean by that? I clenched my fists. David smirked, "When your daughter grows up, I'll have all 3 of them serve me." I knew he was trying to provoke me. I gritted my teeth and smiled. "Keep talking. Keep trying to provoke me. I don't care. I'm here to tell you not to play dirty with me. It won't work. I'll kill your entire family before you can kill me. The real show is just beginning. Let's see if you dare to play along." David pondered for a moment, then nodded. "I'll play along. Crushing a little ant like you is easy." I chuckled softly and left his office. Back at my place, I called my sister. She told me that Mary was on winter break and that they had gone to a small southern city under the guise of a vacation. They could stay there for a couple of months, so I didn't need to worry. I took out the USB drive and looked through its contents. It contained evidence of Royal Real Estate's illegal activities. The most important folder was filled with videos of David blackmailing numerous people. David had built a secret place where many dirty deals took place. Suddenly, I saw a video featuring my father-in-law. The video was from 8 years ago. It dawned on me why my wife had betrayed me. My father-in-law must have been blackmailed by David, and he used my wife as a bargaining chip. My heart bled as I realized that my father-in-law's indiscretions had led to the destruction of my family. What a great father-in-law indeed. I then withdrew several $1 billion and started quietly buying up shares of Royal Real Estate on the stock market. A few days later, James was released. I registered a construction company with him and had his people bid for contracts with Royal Real Estate. After slipping a few million in bribes, we secured a contract to build a bridge for them. Through our detailed investigation, we discovered that David had 2 twin sons from his previous marriage, both recent college graduates working in the company. David's 80-year-old mother lived in a private luxury nursing home and held a significant number of shares in the company. I smirked coldly, proceeding step by step according to my plan. A few days later, my wife contacted me, crying and asking to meet. Thinking about the video of my father-in-law, I agreed. She looked even more haggard than before. When she saw me, she wiped away her tears and lit a cigarette for me. Smiling, she said, "I've heard about what you've been up to. 8 years have passed, and you've gone from a scholar to a strong man." I smoked, leaning on the railing, watching the river flow. "People change," I said. "I have too." Her hair blew in the wind, revealing bruises on her pale neck. She smiled and said, "You've started your revenge plan, haven't you?" Sending our sister and Mary away was the first step. My wife was very perceptive, piecing together my intentions from subtle clues. After being betrayed, I trusted no one, not even James or the big shot. Seeing my silence, she lowered her head and asked, "Am I also a target of your revenge?" I flicked my cigarette but into the river, stretched and said, "What do you think?" Tears fell from her eyes into the river. She said she deserved to die long ago, but couldn't bear to leave Mary. "I saw the video of your father," I said. My wife was stunned, her expression conflicted. After a long pause, she nodded and said, "When my dad told me about it, I was in shock. But he said there was a way out. David demanded that I stay with him for a month, and after that, he would destroy the video." She sighed. "I couldn't bear to see my dad in trouble, so I agreed." From that day on, I felt like I was in hell. I gave a bitter smile, unsure if I was mocking my father-in-law's selfishness or my wife's naivety. She continued, "I didn't know what to do back then. I loved you. I always have, but I was also worried about my dad. So, I followed his advice and it spiraled out of control." Suddenly, she looked at me seriously and asked, "Husband, what can I do to help you?" I shook my head. I couldn't trust her. She had no part in my revenge plan. Seeing my distrust, her expression turned desolate. 8 years have passed. Our family is broken. Our love is gone. All that's left is suspicion and shame. She then said, "The video must have come from your sister, right? If you have other documents, you should verify them. David is very cunning. Your sister getting close to him would make him suspicious. Some of the evidence she left might be fake." I nodded, aware of this. I had other ways to investigate. Documents could be falsified, but the video my sister stole couldn't be. My wife added, "David's secret place is heavily guarded. I suspect there are even worse crimes happening there. If you need, I can sneak in and get footage for you." I pondered for a moment and then nodded. She sighed in relief but started crying again, telling me to be careful. I didn't listen to a word. Sometimes, mistakes can't be undone for a lifetime. The plan in motion after parting ways with my wife. I had James change the legal representative of our newly established construction company to David's twin sons. They were new to the business and thought James was trying to curry favor with them, so they accepted with a smile. Meanwhile, David's elderly mother, living in a luxury nursing home, met an old gentleman. They got along very well, and she seemed to have found a new lease on life. David has been keeping a low profile lately, always surrounded by several bodyguards when he goes out. It seems he's quite wary of me. He's also arranged for protection for his sons and elderly mother, but oddly enough, he hasn't done much to protect my wife. As the chairman's wife, she has free access to his secret locations. True to her word, she managed to get me some explosive footage. The place wasn't just a den of vice, it was also a drug haven. The basement held numerous girls who were subjected to inhumane treatment if they disobeyed. This alone was enough to ruin David and send him to prison. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted him to see his empire crumble and lose everything. During this time, I continued to buy shares of Royal Real Estate, spending $200 million to acquire a 5% stake. The bridge construction had begun, and I instructed James to use substandard materials. David's twin sons were none the wiser. My sister and Mary were still on vacation in the South, worried about my safety, but I told them to wait patiently. David's mother had fallen in love with the charming old gentleman, and they were inseparable. Of course, I wouldn't let my father-in-law off the hook either. He had torn my family apart, and he wouldn't get a peaceful end. But when it came to my wife, I was conflicted. Memories of our loving past clashed with the painful images of her with David, leaving me in agony. A visit from my wife one day, my wife showed up at my house again. She had been coming twice a month to clean while I was in prison, keeping the place tidy as if it were still her home. I watched her coldly as she tidied up. Suddenly, she said, "Husband, let me cook you a meal. It's been so long since you had my cooking." I hesitated, but finally nodded. She made 4 dishes and a soup. Watching her busy in the kitchen felt like a scene from the past, making me feel a bit dazed. After setting the table, she poured me a glass of wine and smiled. It's been 8 years. Today, I feel like the happiest woman in the world. I downed the wine in one gulp and took a bite of the food. It was the familiar taste I hadn't had in 8 years. She raised her glass and drank, then broke down in tears, saying, "Husband, sometimes it feels like a dream. These past 8 years have been so hard. If I could do it all over again, I wouldn't have helped my father, because the person I want to spend my life with is you." Eventually, we both got a bit drunk. She hugged me tightly, and I suddenly noticed a scar on her stomach as her shirt lifted. "What's this scar from?" I asked. Seeing my surprise, my wife started laughing and crying hysterically. "In your first year in prison, David made sure I could never have children again." My eyes widened in shock, recalling David's words. Could he have done the same to my sister? My wife sobbed, "After I die, please take care of Mary." The next morning, I woke up to find my wife gone. She had left breakfast and a note on the table. "I love you. Live well and raise our daughter." I feared she might do something drastic, so I called her, but her phone was off. A while later, she suddenly video called me. I answered, and David's face appeared on the screen. The background was noisy, and I squinted, recognizing the setting from the video my wife had sent me earlier, the basement of the Red Mansion, a place of torture. David smirked. "Did you put her up to this? She dared to try and drug me." My wife, her face covered in bruises, stared at me with determined eyes. David laughed. "Your father? He's not your real father. You were adopted. Did you know that? He lied to you." My wife's eyes widened in disbelief. She had never imagined that the man she respected and sacrificed so much for wasn't her biological father. David continued, "After I found out, I blackmailed him with the video. He swore to deliver you to my bed." David then turned to me. "You want revenge? Come on. I'm waiting." I hung up the phone and called James, saying only 2 words, "It's time." Then I got dressed and drove to the Red Mansion. Today, it would all end. Half an hour later, David's men brought me to the basement. David, smoking a cigarette, looked at me coldly. "You really dared to come?" I glanced around the room. There were over 10 men, all armed with knives. It seemed David wanted to end this once and for all. I said nothing, just stared at him. Just as he was about to speak, his phone rang. It was his mother. David's face turned pale as he answered. The room fell silent, and we could hear her voice faintly, "Son, I'm getting married." "Bless me." "What? Mom, you're getting married? You're 80. That's none of your business." "I'm getting married today, and I'm transferring my shares to him." She hung up, leaving everyone in the room stunned. David was in shock. He looked at me and said, "This is your doing." I shrugged, smiling. Love is free. No one can stop it. I noticed a TV in the room and said, "Turn on the TV. There's a live broadcast." David asked, "What broadcast?" "You'll see," I replied. He had his men turn on the TV, and there was indeed a live broadcast of the Bridges Foundation ceremony. His twin sons were on stage. David's eyes widened in horror. "What are you planning?" I grinned. "Your sons are hard-working. This ceremony is just the beginning of their glorious careers." I set up a construction company and transferred the shares to them to climb up the social ladder. "No, no," David panicked, realizing something. He called his sons, but the TV screen suddenly showed a massive explosion. His sons disappeared in the smoke and chaos. The bridge had collapsed. Royal Real Estate had subcontracted the project, and now it was in ruins. David screamed in agony, "You monster! You're a monster!" At that moment, David's walkie-talkie crackled with urgent voices. "Boss, the police are here for a raid. What do we do?" David was stunned again. I smiled. I happened to have some secrets about this place, so I handed them over. "Don't blame me." David collapsed to the floor, pointing at me. "You're insane. You're truly insane." I stepped forward, smiling. "From the day you coveted my wife, you were wrong. From the day you killed my parents, we became mortal enemies. You're right, I'm insane. I spent 8 years in prison, lost my family, and you think I'd let you go?" Finally, the day had come. David's lips trembled as the sound of police footsteps grew louder. I crouched in front of him. The basement door was broken open by the police. My wife staggered to her feet and walked towards me, saying, "Husband, in the next life, I won't make the same mistakes. I'll love you properly." I didn't understand what she meant, but she suddenly grabbed a knife and stabbed David in the neck. Blood splattered on both of us. My wife was taken away by the police. She wouldn't be coming out. Aftermath: a month later, my sister returned with Mary. Mary gradually accepted that I was her real father. I told my sister, "Revenge is complete." She cried, saying that even if she could never have children, she had no regrets. My father-in-law was investigated and sentenced. I made sure he suffered in prison. Royal Real Estate was dismantled, but a significant portion of the shares remained with the charming old gentleman and me. That old gentleman was David's mother's new husband and also James's father. He had lived a flamboyant life and ended up with a great deal. James tried several times to transfer all the shares to me, but I refused with a smile. I just wanted a peaceful life for the rest of my days. My wife was prosecuted for intentional homicide and sentenced to 10 years. Given her past suffering at David's hands, it was understandable. I smiled bitterly. It seemed things had come full circle. I was sentenced to 10 years, and now she was too. We were like star-crossed lovers, destined never to be together. Despite everything, I realized I still loved her deeply. I took my sister and Mary to visit her. Though she was in prison, her spirits were high, and she looked relieved. She repeatedly told Mary to listen to me and urged me to find another woman. I just listened quietly. Looking into her eyes, I said, "Behave well and keep a good attitude. I'll wait for you." Her eyes lit up, tears streaming down her face. She said nothing, just nodded continuously.